The more that you see them in the wild, the more that you recognize them and, write them down, it's going to all come together.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the 7Sage LSAT podcast. I am Nicole, joined by my lovely co-host, Bailey.
Hi, everybody.
Today, we're going to be talking all about flaws. One of the maybe not fan favorite, but I don't know about you, Bailey. It's one of my favorite questions for sure.
Me too. And we can make it one of your favorites. Just pay attention. We'll get there.
Yeah. Today, this episode could change the course of your list of favorites.
Honestly, yeah, that was wait, sorry. I was just gonna say it was one of my big turning points in my LSAT journey when I realized that flaw questions are predictable, and also once you get good at those, you get good at all those other questions, which I'm guessing you were maybe gonna say.
I was actually gonna say, even if flaws aren't somebody's favorite, unfortunately or fortunately for us, they're one of the most common question types, right? They make up 15% of LR. So it's definitely worthwhile to pretend they're your favorite, at least for the 30 minutes of this podcast, we'll pretend that they're your favorite. So today we're going to talk tips for how to train your muscles of identifying flaws, kind of like what Bailey talked about. So how can we train ourselves to spot flaws in flaw questions? What do you think, Bailey?
Good question. Well, first of all, you have to stop looking to the answer choices right away after you read the stimulus, kind of as a crutch. Honestly, they're not going to help you. They're put there literally to hurt you, not to help you. They're trying to pull you in every which direction, convince you that they're right. 4 of them will literally be wrong. 5 of them will probably look kind of right somehow, but only one of them is right. And so very first thing that I had to start doing was literally just cover up those answer choices and start trying to figure out, why am I not believing this argument already before I even let myself look at those answer choices? And then how do you get better at that? I mean, my simple method is just trying to figure out what's new in the conclusion that's unsupported, not necessarily given to me by those premises. And what do I need to connect it back to in the premises? What am I looking at here in terms of this gap or hole in the reasoning between the premises and the conclusion?
Absolutely. And sometimes your flaw can even be one of the fun ones that we have a name for, right? Sometimes it's just a gap that you can see, but we have a really fun name for at least 20, I think it's 21 flaws.
Wait, how fun is the name? Are the names actually that fun?
Well, ad hominem, fun Latin name. Hasty generalization, fun name. At least they're not just they have a
sufficient
title,
necessary mix up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's named flaws that you can memorize, which if you're a flashcards type of person, you do better by just getting some things memorized. Awesome. Make those flashcards right away. We got a little section in our curriculum that talks about the named flaws, but we'll talk about some of those today as well. And then, the rest of it is just figuring out objectively, what's wrong with this argument? Why am I not believing this person if they were to come up to me in real life and make this argument to me?
My tip, though, if you're going to be one of those flashcard people, which I am one of those flashcards people, and I mean, I would highly recommend, just to train the muscle, have a little cheat sheet. It doesn't even have to be flashcards, just one paper where you wrote out all your flaws from the curriculum. But what I would recommend is that for each one, you actually write yourself an example. It's one thing to know, I know that there is a thing called a red herring flaw. It's another thing to be able to say it out loud and know that you could come up with it yourself. So I would challenge yourself, make yourself maybe a little table. One column is this is the flaw. Next column, here's the example on 7Sage or whatever. Third column, here's the one that I just came up with. And the more creative you are, the better you just get to challenge yourself and learn something. So I have my own cheat sheet where I have an example that I wrote for every single flaw. If you come to any of my flaw classes, I use these same examples over and over. I just have them memorized. For example, relative absolute flaw, I always remember. I say, if a sloth is faster than a snail, that doesn't make a sloth fast. That's just I could spit that out anytime.
That's a good one.
That's relative absolute. And I have one like that for every single flaw. So I would challenge you guys to do the same.
Nice. And also, the more that you spot those in actual questions as well, maybe you want to add another column to really go all the way with this cheat sheet and be where's an example of where I can see this in the real test? Because they're all over the real test. There's plenty of examples of anything. You can just jot down the PT number, section number, question number. You could also write down in your own words what that flaw was in context in the actual test.
That's so smart. If we're just adding columns, although this might be overkill,
yeah,
but another column you could potentially add is how did the answer choice say it? Because one thing that gets students,
it's hard to match that up with the fancy LSAT words.
you spot the flaw, but then like the words are really confusing. So you may also want to just keep track of like how do they use different synonyms to call this flaw in their fancy 5-star language.
Right. Like one of them we talk about is circular reasoning, where it's just kind of like you're restating your premise as your conclusion. You're using as evidence for what you're trying to prove, literally the statement that you're trying to prove. How are they going to say that in the real LSAT? They say fancy words like presupposes. Well, actually, I need to get the actual like quote from the text because I was just going to say presupposes as a premise what they set out to prove,
I
but
think
it's
it
even
says like
fancier than that sometimes.
some of them say like presupposes the truth of what it aims to
Yes.
establish or something like that.
Yes.
So,
Good
fancy
job.
words.
Right. So just the more you
Exactly.
get comfortable with those, the more that you see them in the wild, the more that you recognize them and, you know, write them down, it's going to all come together. But lots of practice that we're going to have to do to get to that point. So let's do some of it today. We're going to actually go through some real questions today. If you
Yeah.
guys are down, we have
And this
some
could
questions that are
mimic
available for free. Oh, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say this could just like mimic your study day. Like if all this advice we're giving you guys, you're like, okay, well, how do I practice this? What we're about to do together, all virtually, is essentially what you could be doing in your study day. You'll have your set of questions. We're gonna read you the stimulus, and you're gonna pause to think about if you can spot the flaw, and we'll give you a chance to marinate in it.
Right. And by the way, quick plug to our classes. Nicole runs a class. It's very similar to this. So do I. Nicole's class, actually talk more about yours. I don't know exactly what you do in it.
My class is called Flaw
Nope.
Patrol. Cut that out. No, I'm just kidding. My class is called Flaw Patrol, not Paw Patrol. Flaw Patrol. No conflict of interest there. Inspired by the children's show, though, where this is exactly what we do: is we take a set of flaw questions. I pick like a random set of 10. For every question, I show the stimulus. We cover up the answer choices. I read it out loud. I give everybody like a minute to marinate. And then in the chat, everybody just drops tons of ideas. Like we'll have tons of people saying, I see this flaw. I see this flaw. I see this flaw. We discuss, we come up with our like big 1 or 2 contenders. And then we see if we were able to catch it in the answer choices. So that's like a challenge, a pre-phrase challenge every week on like 10-ish questions. What about you, Bailey? Bailey does something very similar.
Mine is similar. It's spotting the gap, where then I'm going to basically do a very similar thing to that. I always cover up those answer choices, make everybody look at the stimulus. We break down what's new in the conclusion, what's old in the premises, why am I not believing that conclusion based on those premises, aka pre-phrasing the flaw or gap or hole in the reasoning. And then the catch here is that we don't only apply to flaw questions. And also, I like to bring in other questions that kind of like revolve around this idea of spotting the gap, which that's the name of the class, spotting the gap. I do it twice a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays. I like to bring in strengthen, pseudo-sufficient assumption, where you find the rule, sufficient assumption questions, necessary assumption questions. And honestly, you can bring in parallel flaw. You can bring in weakened questions as well if you want to be practicing this kind of concept on your own. Because this notion of spotting the gap and then, you know, preparing for those answer choices in a slightly different way, depending on the question type, is going to apply to so many questions throughout this test. I'd be willing to bet that then once you've gotten good at that, you're more than prepared for most of the questions that you'll see in an LR section.
Cool. So I guess we're just going to do a demo of that for you guys today. So we have a set of 3 flaw questions. We'll go one by one. For each one of us will read the stimulus, and then we're going to give you guys a second, or I suppose it might be easier to just pause
just pause.
Whatever modality it is that you're listening to this on. Take a second, see if you can come up with a flaw, and then we'll talk it through. All right. Should we go to our first
put
one?
into your own words. By the way, yeah, we should. But if you guys are not watching this on YouTube, you totally can go to YouTube if you want to like physically see the question on the screen. Otherwise, if you're just following along on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, amazing. Try to visualize. I don't know. Come up with some way. You can always rewind to make sure that you got what we just said. Sweet.
Cool.
You got the first one pulled up?
Yes, I do. Okay, here's the question. Question stem. The reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticism in that the argument does blank. All right, here's your stimulus.
Yes.
Some video game makers have sold the movie rights for popular games. However, this move is rarely good from a business perspective. After all, Star Quanta sold the movie rights to its popular game Nostromo, but the poorly made film adaptation of the game was hated by critics and the public alike. Subsequent versions of the Nostromo video game, although better than the original, sold poorly.
Mm. Okay,
Alrighty.
so pause here. You can always rewind if you want to hear that played back. Try to think through what you think the flaw is. And by the way, how do we know that that's a flaw question? It's asking us what the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds of. When they say
Mm-hmm.
most vulnerable to criticism, that is always a keyword for a flaw question.
Mm-hmm.
People mix that up with other question types. It's just flaw. They're asking you what's wrong with the reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. So hopefully you've paused at this point because we're going to start thinking about it together. I don't know what's popping out to you, Nicole, or should I say my thoughts? Like what's the flaw in our own words?
Maybe I'll let you say the flaw, but I could start by a breakdown of like what was the overall conclusion of this argument, right? The conclusion
Yeah.
was trying to prove to us that that this move of like selling the movie rights to a game is not a good business practice, right? Like you probably shouldn't sell the movie rights to your video game. Why?
Right.
Because here's this one game, Star Quanta, and they did that and it didn't end up so well for them. Okay, so this is following a
Right.
classic flaw. Tell us what it is, Bailey.
Well, in that conclusion, they're going so far as saying that it rarely is a good move. I'm like, do we know that's rarely a good move just from this one example where it didn't work out so well? I don't know. Like, think about if somebody gave you that advice in real life. Hey, you really shouldn't do this thing. It's going to be rarely a good move. Why? Well, because I did it once and it didn't work for me. Okay,
Hmm.
cool. How do I know that that's rarely going to be a good move? So, my flaw in my own words that I'm seeing here is just like they're making this big generalization based on one little example. How do I know that that one example is actually going to be enough to prove that general statement about what rarely is the case?
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you have your little cheat sheet of flaws, we do have like a fun, I guess, name. We call this like a hasty generalization. When you
Hasty.
generalize from just a couple or one example to a broader conclusion. Nice. Good
Nice.
work, Bailey.
All right. So, yeah, now what you want to do, especially if you're on your own, is kind of like open up those answer choices. By the way, I'm like literally picturing myself taking off a sticky note from my screen because that's how I train myself to get better at these. I would just
Mm-hmm.
cover up these answer choices on my screen with a sticky note, not allow myself to look at the answer choices until I'm able to pre-phrase that flaw. And then now let's look at these answer choices, see what lines up. I always
Mm-hmm.
remind myself too to keep an open mind for wording. Like, of course, they're going to word it differently than I just worded it. I'm not an LSAT test maker. They are. But you just want to go down these answer choices, kind of translate chunk by chunk and ask yourself, is this descriptively accurate about the stimulus? My first test for these flaw answer choices is just, is this true? And then number two, is this a flaw? Is this just objectively something that's wrong with arguments? Which we already know if we find the one that we pre-phrased, it's going to be objectively a flaw and it's going to be true about the argument.
Yeah, so in this case, we see from the very first answer choice A, that the argument draws a general conclusion on the basis of just one individual case. Perfect, right? Exactly what Bailey just put into her own words. A general conclusion about it being rarely good to sell the rights from one individual case, the whatever, Star, Quanta, Nostromo game. Great.
Right. Perfect. So yeah,
Pat
I
on the
mean, in real
back.
life, yeah, pat on the back. I would pick that answer choice and honestly just move on, especially if it's earlier on in the section. However, if you want to really make sure, and especially during practice, if you want to get better at knowing exactly why the other answer choices are wrong, go through these other answer choices. But that can be like an added thing that you guys do right now if you want to pause and double check that you know why these other answer choices are wrong. Hint, they're all going to be wrong because they're either or both not descriptively accurate about the stimulus and or not actually just an objective flaw in real life.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yay. All
Well,
right.
good
Now that
job.
we know how that's done, let's apply it to some more questions. And then I think we're going to expand the question types by the end of this podcast so that we also apply it to a weekend and a sufficient assumption. So stay tuned if you want to do all of that with us.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Cool. You
should I
want to
hop
take
into the
us through the
next
next one,
question?
Bailey? Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Okay, this one's fun. So, question stem here is just reasoning above is flawed in that it. That one's pretty straightforward. Literally says the keyword flaw. Nice. They're not making me, dig too hard to figure out what question type it is. I'm immediately thinking, let's find the conclusion, figure out where the premises are. What's that gap or hole? Why am I not believing it? So it says Roberta is irritable only when she's tired. Okay. I'm already noticing that there's some conditional reasoning here. You might want to start diagramming on your own. We'll talk about it conceptually as well, because, I can't physically diagram right now. But anyways, I see only when conditional indicator. We could translate this into an if A then B statement. Roberta is irritable only when she's tired and loses things only when she is tired. Okay. Since she has been yawning all day and has just lost her keys, she is almost certainly irritable.
Mm-hmm.
So pause here if you want to break down that stimulus on your own, find the conclusion, ask yourself why you're not buying it. Um, Nicole, what's the conclusion? What are they trying to prove?
They're trying to prove to me that Roberta is irritable. And remember,
Right.
irritable was what we heard at the very beginning. Irritable only when she's tired. So think about that.
Sweet. Okay. So, yeah, what I'm thinking right away is just like if I were to diagram this, or also just conceptually, Roberta is irritable only when she's tired. That means I know that if she's irritable, she must be tired. I know if she loses things, she must be tired. Do I know that if she's tired or if she loses things? Anything else? Do I know that she's irritable in those situations? No,
No.
I just know if she's irritable, then she must be tired. If she loses things, then she must be tired. So, what's this conclusion doing?
This conclusion is making one of our classic, oldest tricks in the book of what we call a sufficiency necessity swap or flip, where it's
Yeah.
mixing up the sides of the arrows, right? Just like Bailey said, we said irritable only when tired. So we were going A to B, irritable
Mhm.
to tired. And then the conclusion is like, therefore she's irritable. We are concluding A. And that should just immediately be a red flag because it's impossible for us to conclude that we have the sufficient condition, right? Anytime I know all A or B, there's nothing I could tell you that would prove to you that I have A, right? The only
Right.
thing I could prove to you is that I had B or I had not A, for example. But I can't just say, therefore, I have A. Therefore, Roberta is irritable. And that's our
Perfect.
classic red flag for a sufficiency necessities flip.
Perfect. Okay. So, with that prephrase, I mean, if you guys now want to look at these answer choices, it's going to get us down to a couple answer choices. This is a little bit of a tougher question, though, because I think there's a couple answer choices that could be contenders here. So, let's kind of pit them against each other, see which one comes out on top, which one's actually entirely descriptively accurate about the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know which ones I'm
So
thinking
we
about?
have, yes, so we have two answer choices that both talk about sufficiency necessity. There's answer choice D that says we're flipping a necessary condition for Roberta's losing things as a sufficient condition, or E, similar, flipping a necessary condition for Roberta being irritable as a sufficient condition. Um, so if we take that at face value, right, remember the conclusion that we're making here is we're concluding about Roberta being irritable, which was originally the sufficient condition. So the flip takes place at the conditional related to irritability. That is
Hmm.
where the final error happened, right? So which answer choice would be more descriptively accurate? It would be the one telling us we have a flip to irritability, right?
Right. So that leaves us with E. Perfect. Yay.
Woo!
Amazing. All right. Yeah. And if you guys feel like you're not very well versed with that sufficiency necessity flip or any sort of conditional reasoning, lots of that in the core curriculum. For me, it was really helpful to just go back in the 7 Sage core curriculum or syllabus to the parts where we talk about sufficient necessary reasoning. It's just conditional reasoning, and get familiar with those indicator words, get familiar with more flaw questions or just any questions that deal with conditional reasoning. There's lots of different ways that you can be practicing that on 7 Sage. You can always go and create a drill that has a conditional reasoning tag and a flaw tag, for example, and then you can see a lot more of these.
Mm-hmm. Should we do one more bonus round, a little bit faster pace? Well, we're already going pretty fast pace, but one more bonus round flaw question.
Yes, let's do it.
Alrighty. Okay, so another flaw question. Which one of the following most accurately describes a flaw in the critic's reasoning? Okay, again, the question stem explicitly says flaw, so we know that what we're looking for is an error of reasoning or a flaw. All right, let's see what we got. So, in the stimulus, we got a critic talking. Critic says, Fillmore, an influential television executive, argues that watching television regularly is not detrimental to very young children. Fillmore bases this claim on, or bases this on the claim, which I grant, that children can learn much that is beneficial from television. Okay, so Fillmore's all like, TV's not that bad for kids because you can learn stuff from it. Okay, but we should reject Fillmore's argument because clearly it is to Fillmore's benefit to convince parents that television is not harmful to their children. Okay,
Nice.
so we'll give you guys a
Pause.
second here. Pause and think about a flaw.
Rewind if
Okay.
you need to. So I
We're
rolled my
back in
eyes hard on this
discussing.
one. I was like, this is a classic flaw. You can't do that. What can't you do here?
You can't attack the speaker or the giver of an argument and use that to disqualify their claim, right? It's like a classic example is when I say, oh, um, mom, like let's say my mom is telling me not to smoke. I'm like, mom, I'm not going to listen to you. You used to smoke. Just because
Right.
she used to smoke doesn't make smoking less unhealthy, right? So I can't just attack someone's personality or their actions and claim that that has something to do with the validity of their argument. What do we call
Right.
that? Fancy
Yeah.
name?
Ad hominem. Fancy
Yep.
Latin name. I honestly never remembered this name for it. I would always just call it like the hypocrite flaw, where it's like,
Mm,
well, yeah, just because you don't practice what you preach doesn't mean that you can't preach it. Like, yeah, it's
hmm.
still an actual valid conclusion. Doesn't matter if you
Absolutely.
follow it or not. So nice. Okay. Let's go with that into these answer choices. Which one of these answer choices lines up with what we are talking about when we describe an ad hominem flaw?
Um, I see answer choice C. It rejects an argument solely on the grounds that the argument could serve the interest of the person making that argument. So it
Perfect.
mentions something about rejecting an argument because of the person's motives, which again has nothing to do with the validity of their claims. Nice.
Right.
Pats on the back
Amazing.
again. Good job,
All
everybody.
right. We're
And
so good at this.
if you didn't spot any of these flaws, by the way, you can think about what are some of the red flags we talked about that might help you spot them in the future. So, like for this question, if you have a person speaking and then you're attacking that person, maybe next time you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I'm criticizing a person. That sounds like an ad hominem or a
Yeah.
hypocrite flaw, or the sufficiency necessity, like Bailey mentioned. As soon as she started reading, she saw the conditional indicator and she's like, oh, conditional indicator. That means we'll probably have a flip. So, think about these flags that you could look for the future to make it easier to spot.
Agreed. Yay. All right. So now let's expand it. Let's talk a little bit about these other questions that you might see. I got a nice sufficient assumption question that we know is a sufficient assumption because the premise, the question stem says the argument's conclusion is properly inferred if which one of the following is assumed. And what I like to really drive home in my spotting the gap class is that this question, those other question types that we mentioned before, are just kind of like flaw questions in disguise. The first two steps of your approach to solve these questions is going to be the exact same. Figure out where the premise and the conclusion are up in the stimulus. Ask yourself why you're not believing that conclusion based on those premises. A lot of times, by the way, for sufficient assumption like this, properly inferred if assumed, we're looking for an added assumption that if it were to be assumed would guarantee the conclusion, make it properly inferred. What we're looking for is some sort of gap between the premises to the conclusion. So usually there's something new in the conclusion that's just not supported by the premises, and we just need to tie it back up to something they were trying to prove in the premises.
Mm-hmm.
So for this one, it says clearly a democracy cannot thrive without. Ooh, right away, conditional language. If it helps you to diagram, please diagram. Clearly a democracy cannot thrive without effective news media. Okay. After all, a democracy cannot thrive without an electorate that's knowledgeable about important political issues. And an electorate can be knowledgeable in this way, okay, only if it has access to unbiased information about the government. Pause here, think it through. What's new in the conclusion, old in the premises? That's going to be the easiest way to spot this gap.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Are you noticing anything, Nicole, or do you want me to talk through this one?
I am noticing, right, that in our conclusion, we have one huge loose end, which is the mention of effective news media, right? Even if you are
Right.
just listening along to this and you don't have a paper pencil handy, you could have heard that a lot of the terms repeated. So we talk about democracy thriving. Thriving goes to knowledgeable. Knowledgeable goes to unbiased information. And then randomly in the conclusion, we jump to, okay, effective news media. So the gap was that how did we get from unbiased information about the government to suddenly this being the same thing as effective news media? So we know that we need to add a piece that'll connect those two and tell me, okay, if in order to have access to unbiased information, I got to have effective news media, basically, in whatever way they're going to phrase that, maybe with a synonym or two, but that's the gist of it, right? So do we have an answer choice that
Right.
does that?
I think so. Yeah. What I like to do is just skim down these answer choices and look for effective news media, unbiased information about the government. And honestly, unless I'm missing something, that just leaves me with E, right?
Mm-hmm.
E
Yep.
talks about
Without
effective news
effective.
media. Yep. Without
Yep.
effective news media, an electorate will not have access to that unbiased information about the government.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. And if you were diagramming, you add that little answer choice as a chain in your diagram, it's going to get you from premise to conclusion. That's exactly what we're looking for, something that's enough on its own to fill that gap.
Absolutely.
All right.
So
Shall we squeeze that last question in here?
I think we may be able to.
Okay.
So
Real
I can
quick.
go ahead and take us through this last one.
Perfect.
So here we go. Wait. Sorry. Okay, here we go. We're looking for a weakener here. So which one of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? Similar thing. I'm looking for a gap or hole, and I'm going to target it with my answer choice. All right. In its coverage of a controversy regarding a proposal to build a new freeway, a television news program showed interviews with several people who would be affected by the proposed freeway. Of the interviews shown, those conducted with people against the new freeway outnumbered those conducted with people for it 2-1. So there's more people against freeway than there are for the freeway, pro freeway. Okay. The television program is therefore biased against the proposed freeway. Okay. Pause here and think about if you can spot any big gap holes or like flaws in this reasoning. Okay. Bailey, did you spot anything? Or do you want me to talk through
Can
my
you do
thoughts?
it? Sorry.
Yeah. So here, the gap of reasoning is that we jump straight from saying that one group is outnumbering the other to just assuming that means that the television is biased, right? There could be many other explanations for why one group outnumbers another that doesn't have to do with bias. And so I don't necessarily have a more eloquent, fancy way to, talk that through. But the idea is I want to be able to identify maybe an alternative explanation for why a news station might outnumber in one group. And so answer choice D does a really good job of doing that, telling me, okay, well, what if just in general there are more people that support this freeway than don't? So it's not a bias. It's just like there are more of these people out there. That's exactly what answer choice D says, right? Before the program even aired, twice as many people were against the building than were in favor of it. And that could explain. So it may not have anything to do with bias at all. Cool.
Perfect. And by the way, that introducing an alternative explanation, especially when it's some sort of causal reasoning, classic weakener. So again, if you want to get more familiar with these like cookie cutter answer choices that you're going to see all over this test, jot down what was special about these answer choices that we just pointed out during this class. And you'll start to see them all over the test. And all of it has to do with this spotting the gap, pinpointing the flaw, what's wrong with this conclusion based on those premises.
Cool.
Yay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. What were we going to say?
Well, I was just saying, hopefully this gave you guys some good practice in spotting the gap and you get a little sneak preview of what we do in class. If you have any questions about anything we talked about today or any questions you want us to go over in Beat the LSAT, go ahead and drop those recommendations in the comment window. Otherwise, like, subscribe, click the notification bell so you don't miss the future LSAT tips from us. And we hope to see you in a future episode. Well, maybe not you in the episode, but we hope to have you as a listener in the future. Maybe you, though, if you want.
You never know.
You never
All right.
know. See you guys
Bye,
next time.
everybody.